Well, welcome. It's the 20th anniversary of Operation Iraqi Freedom. As you well know, many of you were involved. And one of the things, it's just really weird when I think of that, because I think there are people who would have joined the military a month before and just retired. Which is really strange. Their entire career would be defined by Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom. I was asked to give how the heck did we get involved and what happened, because one thing about my students, maybe not so much to you, everything's ancient history, everything. Operation Iraqi Freedom is an odd one because it has so many origins. Of course, there's 9/11, the attack on the towers. And most people would say that's Operation Enduring Freedom. But there's also the 1990 Persian Gulf War. And maybe if you want to go back, there is the post-World War II Cold War proxy struggles in the Mideast. Or if you want to go back, let's go back to World War I and the death of the Ottoman Empire, when everything was messed up. And I highly recommend Jon Stewart's Comedy Central on where they talk about Iraq and how the British particularly wrote map lines whatever way they went. So all of this goes back a very long way. As we know, Iraq is a very ancient civilization. There's a Tigris and Euphrates River, the cradle of much of civilization in the West. Well, okay, you have to go back. And what happened was, of course, we launched Operation Enduring Freedom after 9/11. But in the 90s, beginning with Desert Storm, when Saddam Hussein took over Kuwait, we'd had no-fly zones. We had UN resolutions about weapons of mass destruction. They were worried about atomic weapons and biological weapons because, oddly enough, Saddam Hussein had used biological and chemical weapons against his own people, and we took that as a hint, not a stupid hint, that he had some. So the UN had agreed and passed a resolution that if Saddam Hussein was any indication, he had weapons of mass destruction, that people could act, or the UN could act, or someone could act. And we decided that meant us. So there had been indications that they might have had it. So we went to the UN and demanded that Saddam Hussein take inspectors to go to Iraq and go to all the sites they may have been, where they might have been doing these weapons. So they did. They went. And we were convinced, though, they were still hiding them, and that he wasn't really cooperating, but he said he was, and a lot of the inspectors said he was. But we were firm in our conviction that he was doing it, and we presented it to the UN, that he was still making weapons of mass destruction. Our allies, some said, you're wrong, France, Germany, others backed our play, particularly Great Britain, and they will always back our play in this war. And the Prime Minister of Britain will suffer politically, but he decided that we were right. Now, as someone who was in Washington at the time, what struck you was that regardless of weapons of mass destruction, which were never found, it was not a very large military, it was a military operation. And you're like, oh yes, Dr. Gannon, Captain Obvious. But they kept calling it an operation, as opposed to a war. And if the people in Washington, at most, the ground troops were about 160,000. Now, as you know, we won lickety-split, 3 weeks. Air Force bombed them very successfully, as they do. We had complete air supremacy, and we invaded Iraq for a military operation that went extraordinarily well. In fact, we declared combat operations over within weeks. Of course, we know they weren't. So a lot of Iraq became about what they called at that time Phase 4, which was after the war is over, what happens? And I have to say, I always tied one thing. We always said we wanted regime change. And said, well, once we get rid of Saddam Hussein. And I remember sitting in Washington going, well, it's a regime. It's a set of people. He has supporters. He's had this long-term support. More needs to be done. So that's what it became about. A brutal counterinsurgency and insurgency, which was not how anyone envisioned it. Having been there, many of you are too young. Having been there, that's not what was envisioned at all. And then it became the war we remember. But all of these gentlemen had an involvement. They had a ground eye view. I sort of had the rear echelon person view of it. So we're going to hear from them on what they felt. And I'm going to ask them a series of questions I'd like each to address, if they feel comfortable. Nothing, this is really going to be very oral history-like, which is what I do. I'm just going to ask very broad questions. I'm not putting anyone on the spot, and then it's going to tell me how they feel about things. So let me first introduce them. We have Jim Stoddard here. Jim Stoddard was a Marine. How many Marines do we have, sir? Oh my God, no Marines. You're all alone, buddy.
So it's a smart room then.
I expect great things from this room. After boot camp, he went to military intelligence school. He did a couple of tours in the West Pac, as they'd say, the Western Pacific. He ended up in Iraq in 2007. A nice time to go. Lovely, particularly since it was August. In 2013, he says, I got out of the Marine Corps. Nobody gets out of the Marine Corps. It's like a life sentence or something. We're a Marine for life. And he's doing, believe it or not, his dissertation on, guess what? The Marines, yes, see? He's in the PhD program in UCF's Tech and Technology. He's focusing on Marine Corps cultural history and memory. Now, Mike, many of you know, excuse me, he is the director of the Office of Military and Veterans Success at the University of Central Florida. He is focused on many of you and your success. And I really do like how he explained it to us when we met, that it's a life cycle from beginning to you leave to later. Your success not only at school, but later on in school, after school, because that's essential. He is responsible for overseeing the deployment of 5 Corps to Operation Iraqi Freedom. He led the 5th Corps Tactical Assault Command into Iraq on day 1. So he's very much, 07, day 1. Mike retired from the Army after 23 years, including multiple deployments to humanitarian assignments, combat, to all sorts, so he has a wide variety of positions. He served at multiple levels of staff and command, and that's a very typical officer path. He retired to Central Florida in 2016. He graduated from UCF, he's a 9-2, with a Master's of Education, Master of Arts in Educational Leadership, and a graduate certificate in college teaching and leadership. He was inducted into Salute, the Veterans National Honor Society at the University of Central Florida. Being fair, Army, Marines, Air Force, and Navy's in the, Navy is in the Army. Colonel Mike Peeler is the commander of the Air Force Reserve ROTC detachment. He's professor of aerospace studies. He leads all recruiting, administration, instruction, and evaluation activities required to develop and support 250 prospective Air Force officers. He graduated from the Air Force Academy with a degree in human factors engineering. He served in numerous squadron, wings, MAJCOMs, and joint positions. Another thing officers do, to include deriving capability and programmatic strategy for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's a command pilot with over 3,500 hours in the C-141, C-17, and C-5, and has accrued over 320 combat hours in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, New Dawn, Inherent Resolve, and Joint Forge. That's one thing, we tended to change the names of what we were doing occasionally. He's a graduate of the School of Advanced Military Studies, the Air War College Grand Strategy Program, and the MIT Seminar 21 program. Prior to the current position, Colonel Pierre commanded the 436 Operation Group, Dover Air Force Base, Delaware. So as you can see, we have a wide variety of experience. We have on-the-ground people. We have people who can tell us from their perspective the story of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So I'm going to start with the way we do in oral history a lot, because I want the audience to get to know you guys. Why did you join the military? Why did you decide to have a number of years in the Marine Corps, or spend your entire life and career in the Air Force and the Army? We'll start with Jim.
Thank you for coming to this. So I graduated high school in 2003. So OIF kicked off in March. I graduated in May. I went to boot camp in June. The reason, though, I was on that path comes back to 9/11, similar to what Dr. Gannon was saying about OIF, going back to 9/11. But when that happened, I was already considering a path in the military. And once those attacks occurred, it just became a matter of what branch and how soon can I go. And so I spent the subsequent 2 years meeting with recruiters, and the Marine Corps, I liked their sales pitch, because that's what it comes down to in recruiting, is the sales pitch. I liked what I was hearing. I thought it was really, in my opinion, the best of the services to go into. You okay over there? I know
I'm okay.
I know
I'm recovering from an illness. That's what it is.
So I enlisted into the late entry program in the summer of 2002, I guess, knowing that going to boot camp when I would be going, we'd be engaged in, at least with Afghanistan at that time, and then Iraq kicked off a few months before I went. So the entire time in boot camp, we were regularly reminded by our drill instructors that you're going to war, you join during wartime, all that kind of stuff. When I graduated boot camp in September, went to Intel School up in Virginia, and it was more impressed upon us that Iraq's. At that time, we knew it wasn't over in the summer as we might have thought it would have been. So we were actually pulled out of class one day and told that all of our orders were being changed to go to political units that were getting ready to go either to Iraq or Afghanistan at that time. So then it kind of changed for me, because I got orders to a F-18 unit out in Miramar in California, and they had just gotten back from Iraq and were put on a Westpac cycle. So my first two actual deployments in the Marine Corps were to the Western Pacific, working with allied partners and training, exercises, things like that. Staying at Air Force bases quite a bit, which I come to enjoy. Much nicer than the Marine Corps establishment. We joke that the temporary quarters on the Air Force stations were nicer than the permanent quarters on the Marine Corps bases. So it was always great to stay there. But by 2007, my unit was slated to go back to Iraq for, I guess, OIF-2 and the beginnings of the surge to provide air support, close air support, reconnaissance, things like that. We deployed in August of 2007 and left in March of 2008. And in that time, we were on Al-Assad Air Base out in the western part of Iraq. Some of you may have been there. My job was to brief and debrief the air crew, assess threats to the air, look at the footage that they took from the air of insurgents and placing IEDs, things of that nature, and plotting those coordinates and suggesting where we could drop some ordnance or send in ground units to do investigate those areas, do raids of cache, weapon caches, things like that. So I didn't have in my opinion, I didn't have much of a first-hand experience in the war. I felt kind of isolated on the base, and at the time, the commander of that base wouldn't let anyone off of it unless they were ground forces going out. So we stayed where we were, and 12 on, 12 off, and made sure those aircraft went out as capable as they could, knowing what the threats were and with the ability to engage them. Then when I got back from Iraq, went to Marine Corps Forces South, Joint Command, with concern for the Caribbean and Central South America, and then from there to a Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort for Marine Wing Support Squadron. And it was at that time that I was beginning my medical discharge for losing my eyesight. So that is what kind of ended my Marine Corps career. Dr. Gannon mentioned that it's possible that people could have joined the military in February, March of 2003, just be coming up on their 20th year and retiring. In some senses, that would be me. If I were still in, my retirement would be coming up in a few months in June. And it's really impressed upon me now that getting over war. But that 10 years of my life in the Marine Corps were so defining. And also, I should mention, you don't really ever get out of the Marine Corps. It's, we still keep that feeling and that mentality and that culture brings us, stays with us for most of our lives. And even though that 10 years is now 10 years ago, I still am involved in Marine Corps activities. My dissertation is on Marine Corps culture and memory. Can't seem to get away from it and don't really want to. And then I get to do stuff like this with other veterans and talk to other veterans. So I'm sure that was long enough. So that's me.
Okay, so Mike.
Why did I join?
Yeah.
Why did I join? Very simple. So this is talk about oral history, going back into a history lesson. It's very simple. Ronald Reagan. 1979, I was 9 years old. I campaigned. The first political campaign I was part of was putting yard signs in my neighbor's yards for Ronald Reagan. When he came into office and everything happened, and the hostages came back from Iran, the impact of a strong defense hit me. And I would say at the age of 11, at breakfast over a bowl of cornflakes, I told my mom at the age of 11 that I was going to join the Army. That was the only thing I wanted to do with my life. I applied to one college, the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. And while I was waiting to get accepted into the Citadel, I started the contract process with the Army recruiter. So either way, whether I got accepted in the Citadel or whether I was enlisted and going in, I was going to the Army when I left schools because I had a strong sense of purpose and an affinity for what the military and a strong defense meant for the country.
So, we're probably all wondering why the Air Force. No, just kidding.
We got the nicest faces.
I know you did, yes. I stayed at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base before at the dawn of time, and it was lovely.
So why did I join the Air Force? My 5th grade teacher, Mr. Leroy Kessler, was a private pilot. I grew up in California, Central California. Farming community, nobody knows anything about the military. But he had an airplane, and he said that if I got an A in his class in 5th grade for the first semester, he would take me for a flight. So I sat in the front row, like I'm not joking about like, okay, I'm interested now. And I got an A, and he took me flying. And then second semester, if I got another A, he would take me flying, and this time on a night flight. I was hooked. That's all it took. Those teachers having that profound influence on your life. And so from then on, I just wanted to be a pilot. That's all I wanted for my life. I heard of this school in Colorado where you could go get a degree and they would pay for you to do that and they would teach you how to fly, and then that's all it took. So I've always just wanted to be a pilot. Got to live my dream.
I'm going to ask you the next question. I mean, I read all the, and by the way, all services are addicted to acronyms and say things that make no sense. For most people. Go ahead. Okay. So, tell me, or how were you prepared to go through this war?
That is such a funny question. And the reason I say funny, by the time we got to the invasion, by the time we got to this date 20 years ago, I was in my 4th company command. Most captains command 1 company.
Yeah, I was about
The
to.
lucky ones get 2 companies. I wound up with 4 company commands. So when you think about the preparation, it's crazy because in November of 2002, I was in command of 503rd Chemical Detachment. We were the very first consequence management assessment team stood up in Europe after 9/11. And we were in Huntsville, Alabama doing our tech escort training. I got a phone call from the 5th Corps Chief of Staff and the Special Troops Battalion Commander said, oh, by the way, the minute you get back, start changing command inventories because you're taking over headquarters at Force Company. 5th Corps, because you're the guy that's going to lead us into it. No idea that was going to happen. No idea that was coming. Got back in end of November after Thanksgiving. We got back, went right into change command inventories, and when you talk about what training, you're trained all along, preps you for it. But the problem with that is that your training that you have isn't always focused the right way. So I just wrote this last, again, I've been on a self-journey the last couple of days. Wrote this last night because I still vividly remember sitting on the burner in the attack position, watching artillery fire impact on the Iraqi positions on the other side, and asking myself, was I ready to lead this 300-person unit organization, tactical self-command post into what was coming? Did I remember everything? Did I have the right skill sets? And this is my 4th command. We've been through NTCs, JRTCs, external evaluations, every training thing you could ever do leading up to that. But on the night we led into it, I still had to take a moment of self-reflection to ask myself the questions, because you're leading, at that point, it was just over 300 folks, into danger, where you don't know what's going to happen next. So as you sit there, think about it, you question everything. Like, what don't I have? What do I have? And luckily, my battalion XO, who was up there, saw me over on the distance, and Zach walked over and said, hey, you're ready. Stop doubting yourself and just do what you've been trained to do. So no matter how much training you have, as you get ready to lead those forces into combat for the first time, you still have all this self-doubt, and you still have all of this, am I really ready to do this? And that was through every deployment that we went over there. But that first one, as we got ready to invade, watching those rounds hit the other side, I was in an 18th Field Artillery Brigade. We fired cannons all the time. I called for fire in Viegas back when we still had Viegas. But to see those rounds impact on the other side and know that that was an Iraqi fighting position put a whole different level to what we were about to go do, and question myself to make sure I was ready.
How many times were you in Iraq?
So I actually 4 deployments to Iraq. I am one of the, I like to tell people 2 ways. I'm one of the lucky people that qualifies for every campaign start of the campaign. I was in Iraq from 2003 to 2011, at some point for every calendar year except for 2007. So Iraq became a home away from home almost.
I guess I want to ask another follow-on, because it's something I'm always curious, and other military people are. In other wars, you stay till it's won. In World War II, I mean, what was it like going back and forth through the various phases?
It was good and bad, and I say that because once you go the first time, you build friendships with the Iraqi people, you build relationships, you have things that you've experienced together. So when you come back the next time, those people are still your friends. They remember you, you remember them, you still continue to build that relationship. There was times it got very frustrating going back because things you put in place had fallen apart and you had to reestablish them. So if units had different viewpoints and different priorities, that would change with every rotation. But I think for me, the thing about going back was my second tour in Iraq, I helped establish the Iraqi Center for Lessons Learned, modeled after what we were doing at the Center for Army Lessons Learned. So myself and two Marines out of the Marine Corps Center for Lessons Learned stood this thing up. And the relationships we built with that 12-man organization, the Iraqi Center for Lessons Learned, was able to really support what I did in the last two rotations because of the relationships I built with those members of ICL, Iraqi Center for Lessons Learned, because they all became important inside the military as they continued to grow the Center for Lessons Learned. So those relationships sustain some of the stuff we did at the end.
Colonel, you want to quantify that because Mike and Mike.
I want to go back to your previous question about preparation. So,
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you. I wanted everyone's view.
Yeah, so, look, I joined the Air Force back in the 1900s, so before 9/11. But I'll tell you that most of my time has been shaped by this series of wars that we've had, Iraq, not the least of it. So what do we do for training and preparation? So in the airlift fleet in C-17s, we had already been flying into combat zones for a number of years after 9/11. We'd already been getting shot at on the way in, dropping off our Army and Marine brethren and getting shot at on the way out. And so going into Iraq, in some ways, was not a lot different. But I'll tell you that we didn't know necessarily that we were going to invade Iraq until we got pretty close. And I remember one day I was called by the scheduler, hey, you got a meeting over you got to be in the sim building this afternoon at 2 o'clock. What is it for? I'm not on the schedule to be doing my sim training. I can't tell you what we're doing. And so we went into the simulator, and it turned out that they had downloaded all the graphic models for Iraq, and we were practicing. I was a young instructor pilot. We're practicing flying approaches in and out of Iraqi airspace in the simulator. And this is months prior to the invasion, because we wanted to make sure that our crews were ready. And I think this is a common theme in the military, is that we're going to do everything we can to make the training environment get you ready to go. It wasn't much later that we put craters in the runway at Saddam International Airport. Every 1,000 feet that we put a bomb in the middle of the runway so that their fighters couldn't take off in air seconds. Well, what that meant was now that the airlift guys, we've got to go resupply, we've got to take stuff in there, and we couldn't land on the runway. And so we landed on the parking gate, where we normally park airplanes. They cleared them out and they painted some stripes, and we took off and landed from there. And I remember my departure out of there was interesting. C-17 is a pretty high performance airplane, does some really cool stuff, but we have to usually follow international airspace rules. Except this time, because we got some good intel that, hey, there's some bad guys out there. We want you to take off and climb to 50 feet above the ground, go as fast as you can, accelerating all the way down the airfield, down the runway. And as soon as you hit the end of the airfield, actually when you hit the Euphrates, zoom climb all the way up. You deplete your airspeed as you're climbing and get as high as you can, because the threats are right on the other side. Stuff that we could never do in Germany or the United States or any place where there's actual rules for how to fly. But we had been able to practice those in the sim and in other tactical training environments so that we were ready to go. But I think that's it.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because when you look at the invasion, and you look at both the 5th Corps headquarters and 2nd Brigade 3ID, we were already in Kuwait in 2002. In November of 2002, when I was in the States, the 5th Corps headquarters and 2nd Brigade 3ID were already in Kuwait doing Operation, I think it was Desert Spring was the name of it. It was the annual exercise we go over there to do. So we were already looking at what those plans were going to be. We had an idea of, if required to do this, we knew who's going to go left, who's going to go right. We knew when the Marines got added to the ground force component, that added a little bit of new calculus we were going to have to do. So there was some preparation, for the invasion itself, which wound up, as you said, got us through the first 3 phases pretty well.
So my preparation, obviously not involved in the initial invasion, but by the time 07 came around, it was, a full-blown counterinsurgency effort. And prior to that, we had done multiple training exercises, like you're saying. I mean, you simulate as best you can. And then before deploying over there, we went out to Yuma, Arizona for a few weeks and played around in the deserts of Arizona, and really kind of focused in on, the air crew focusing on close air support and aerial reconnaissance. And as a new intel chief for the squadron, all of a sudden it was my responsibility to brief and debrief these guys, figure out what the threats are, analyze them, is there patterns to the enemy movement, things like that. Take back, we were doing, I think while we were in Iraq, we were doing, I don't know that there was an hour of the day that we didn't have an aircraft in the air. So they were regularly coming back with new information that me and one other guy, as another intel analyst that I had, a corporal working with me, we had the duty of hearing what they had to say, what the pilots had to say, turning that into intelligence, reporting it to the commander so he could make appropriate decisions on what the next round of mission should be. And we also had an imagery analysis component because we were an F-18 Delta squadron. So it was a two-seater fighter aircraft, but also had the capability of aerial reconnaissance through different imagery sensor platforms. So the imagery analysts would get their products or their information to turn into intelligence products. But we spent, we dedicated ourselves there in Yuma for those few weeks there to really hone our craft and realizing, for me especially, not having deployed to a combat theater yet, this was no longer notional. This was no longer pretend. This was no longer tank hulks out in the bombing ranges in Southern California. This wasn't learning to do air-to-air engagements, training with the Thai Air Force or the Thai fighters. This was real-world stuff where not so much would there be a threat at that time to fixed-wing assets we were flying, but there would be Marines and soldiers on the ground that were in harm's way. And it was our aircraft's job to make sure that we had the right intelligence, the right ordnance, and the right headspace to provide air support in whatever way that was for those ground guys, and make sure they came home back to their bases safely, and the only casualties were the enemies to take. So and then like you said, Mike, when you're sitting in the berm looking over, wondering if you're ready. I felt that too with the transition that we did, getting in to Iraq, transitioning with the outgoing squadron, and just whatever they could tell me about their time that last 6 or 8 months, I was trying to download and ingest and emulate and improve on as best I could. And then 6 or 7 months later, doing the same thing for the incoming unit. And what my lessons learned are, and only having done one cycle over there, but still I could appreciate that, every 6 or so months it's changing hands. And you probably repeat a lot of the same mistakes that your predecessor made. And you might only have 2 or 3 months of where you're really on it. You really know your stuff. And then all of a sudden it's time to go. And do what you can to make sure the next guy's coming on, do what they were doing. And while they're not only helping, working with our unit, but every ground unit that came through, and talking with them personally, and what do you guys need, what do you expect from us, that kind of stuff. And just really being there to help and serve and back up the trigger pullers on the ground as best I could.
Listening to you, I've sort of switched one of my questions, and I'm going to ask it each. I'll start with Colonel Peeler. So a lot of, when I was in Washington, I'll be very honest, this is an honest moment, everyone thought the all volunteer force was great. They were convinced, absolutely convinced. I went to G2 Army all the time, and they were in bad shape mentally because they had to deal with the manpower requirements and deployments, and this thing they called the horse blanket, which was like sacred. You see, he's laughing. And so what did you think about your comrades? And I'll start with you and then just go down the line.
With regard to.
Enlisted officers, enlisted I think is what people would say. Because you guys said, I always wanted to fly. Oh, I was in the Army eating my cornflakes. Or a lot of people are either in the Army eating their cornflakes. Or it's all about flying in Air Force Academy. So what did you think about the all-volunteer force and your comrades, whatever you want to say on it?
So two stories, I'll give quick anecdotes. I was the crew that was supposed to go pick up some sensitive weapons that Saddam had. I was designated prior to the invasion. We knew that we were the crew that was going to go get it. They couldn't find it. But I ended up over there at Aviano Air Base in northern Italy, and we're getting ready to open the northern front in Iraq. And so I'm living for several weeks while we're waiting to find this stuff. I'm living with the 173rd Airborne Brigade. And these are 17, 18, 19-year-olds that are about to jump out of a C-17 into northern Iraq. And what we thought at the time was going to be one of the biggest aerial insertions since World War II. And looking into their eyes, I felt, I'm a little bit protected, right? I'm the air crew. We're going to go in, we're going to drop these guys off, and we're going to come back. But looking into their eyes was tough because, and I'd already been in, Afghanistan. I'd already flown in combat missions. They didn't know what they were about to do. They knew it was scary, and they were scared. And I could see it in their faces. And I'm living with them for a couple of weeks as we're getting ready, and we're planning this airdrop. And I really felt very strongly for them, and just kind of watching them walk around was its own thing, like its own atmosphere there. Now they ended up doing very well. We dropped them into Basher Airfield in northern Iraq, opened the northern front. It wasn't much longer though that I'm flying a C-17 back from theater, and we're bringing back what we call transfer cases. Others might call them caskets with flags on them. And the whole back of the airplane has 8 or 12 of these, and we did these missions periodically. And every time we did that, I would walk downstairs into the back of the airplane, and I would just take a moment with each of them. And I would read the card, but one hit me the strongest. I think I was 25 years old at the time, and I'm looking at the card. I can't see inside the casket. It's just a flag-draped box, but I can read the description. And this young man was the same age I was. And I'm bringing him back. And that was hard. One of the hardest things I've done. And those are the moments that you feel very vulnerable. You feel very human. And we all have this bravado or this kind of Superman, invincible, but it's in those moments that you feel very human and you really care. You walk back upstairs to the flight deck and you want to give everybody a hug, because you care about them. Maybe.
Same question?
Yeah.
I would tell you that the all-volunteer force, over the course of, my 8 years there, numerous deployments with the same people over and over again, from all ranks. One young man, I watched him go from E1 to E6 while we were deployed. And that's how often we were deployed together. The all-volunteer force, as you looked at it did incredible. I watched young service members, 25, 22 years old, learn to take charge, learn to negotiate with a foreign entity, learn to be responsible and accountable, not just for their squads and the people that are left and right, but also for the people in their community of the neighborhoods they were patrolling. I watched an all-volunteer force come together. The day we lost our first soldier, we were devastated. But I watched a company come together and surround itself with compassion and care, knowing they were getting ready to go right back out. So when you look at, your question with the all-volunteer force, was it stressed? Was it tired? Absolutely. When you were in an employed environment, you were going 16, 17, 18 hours a day, hoping to catch 4 hours of sleep before you went back out. You were living on Red Bulls and Gatorade. The greatest trick in the world was to pour a little bit of your Gatorade out, fill it up with Red Bull, just shake it up because it tasted fantastic. Blue Gatorade was the best with Red Bull. I'm forever being an advocate. We're tired of that, and are we suffering today because of some of it? Absolutely. And we put some wear and tear on our bodies while we were there. It's just not ever going to be the same again. But from a manpower's perspective, from a horse blanket perspective, as someone who used to study the horse blanket and know in and out and backwards and forwards and know what I had to go next, our young soldiers, our young paratroopers, they looked at the same thing. They knew they were going next, and they were prepared for it. They knew what they were going to be doing. So from all the fears of the all-volunteer force would fall apart when we got there, they did. They did fantastic. And there were so many moments just to be proud of them as we did different things and to watch some of the genius things they came up with. When you have a vehicle break down and your motor sergeant figures out how to fix it with an MRE box and 550 cord to keep it moving through the desert for the invasion, that's genius. But Billy Macy and Tommy May did it. It was literally a flywheel and a pulley. It got replaced with an MRE box and 550 cord long enough to get us where we were going. And it was amazing. It was that kind of ingenuity and genius stuff they did that just kept everybody going.
Jim?
So coming in, after September 11th, obviously there's my peers. We didn't know that peacetime all volunteer. That 25 years between Vietnam and 2001. But my drill instructors, my intel school instructors, all my senior NCOs, my officers, they were of that generation, and among the best people I've ever met and worked with. That they had that training, and Operation Southern Watch, things like that, being a lot of being air crew. They were the enforcers of that no-fly zone at times. My drill instructors would have, by their rank and stuff, would have come in the mid-90s, the late 90s. Some of them may have gone to Kosovo, Bosnia, places like that if they came in sooner. So they prepared, in my opinion, they prepared us well for what we were to expect and what we were to do. And when they rotated out of those instructor billets, they were back in the fleet, deploying alongside the Marines they trained, and carrying on that standard. And as far as the volunteers that I was a part of, I guess like a kind of drawing the line into wartime, I guess. So many of them did much more impressive and dangerous and heroic things than I could even imagine for myself. And to get to serve alongside them was inspiring, to get to work with them and be a part of the unit with them. Coincidentally, with my own research now, I break up the 20th century Marine Corps along generational lines, and one of the generations I focus on is that all-volunteer generation from post-Vietnam through the 1990s, and getting their oral histories, what they remember of Marine Corps culture, and if they notice the change after September 11th, or if they notice a change as the draftees aged out, if they chose to stay in the 1970s and 1980s, things like that. So it is an important time in our military in the 20th century. this all-volunteer idea, because prior to that, everybody thinks of drafting in Vietnam, or maybe World War II, but the draft began in World War I and subsided a bit in the interwar period, but basically since 1940, pre-Pearl Harbor, we had been drafting American citizens through selective service into the military to do a stint. Everybody, probably remembers Elvis going against haircut, in the 1950s. So it wasn't a sure thing, I guess, is probably what you're getting at, what their concern was in the Pentagon. This isn't a sure bet that we've had a major military operation, with the exception of the Gulf War, I would say, where it was an all-volunteer force that was going to be in for the length of this war to fight it. And I remember threats of the draft coming back in the late 2000s in the halls of Congress. They were debating it, and whether that was just a scare tactic or politics, I don't really know. But I do remember that being discussed, and I do remember the larger majority opinion, rather, of the people I was around was, no, we don't want that. We want to stay all volunteer. We want people that choose this profession, even if it's just for 4 years. We want them here because they want to be here.
As Kepner, they thought the volunteer army/service was toast. They were just saying that's what the other reps at the Pentagon were thinking. They thought it was all, and I think everyone was always astonished. So how did your family and friends react when you were in Iraq or going to Iraq? How did they feel about it? Mike, Mike wanted to say.
How do they feel about it? Terrified. I guess the best way to put it. And really unique. There's two versions of the story. Invasion version. I think when we got ready for the invasion, again, this was in 2002, 2003, and I was in Europe. So family readiness groups still weren't a real big thing in Europe. There wasn't a real big FRG focus in Europe because it was all about, where you're going to go on the train that weekend. And we'd not been a country of war, so we really didn't need to have a robust FRG. So initially, it was terrifying because there was a lot of information for the families. There was a lot of stuff going on. And again, if you go back to the invasion, there was no communications. I left to go to the attack position March 18th. The night of March 17th, I got a phone call from home. I got the email, the Red Cross notices call home to find out that my dad had a heart attack on the 17th. Okay, no, not good. I went to the attack position on the 18th, not knowing if my dad was alive or dead. Trying not to focus on that piece of it because I had 300 folks I was in charge of. But I was taken across the border in hours. And it wasn't until mid-April that I was able to get to a phone to be able to get confirmation from my mom. I had an email, but I didn't trust the emails at that point. So you get terrified. It was a lot of it. Later deployments, it was anxiety. My son was born October of 07. I deployed in January of 08 for 15 months. So for my wife, it was terrifying because she was going to raise a newborn on her own. She had the support of the communities. We were Bragg at that point with a strong FRG. She had a strong support around her, but she was raising a newborn by herself as a first-time mom. He's 90 days old and I'm gone. You ain't changing your deployment window. You got to go. That was a surge. We talked about the surge earlier. That was a surge deployment, so it was 15 months. I think that made it stressful for the family because we knew going into it was 15 months. It wasn't an easy 12-month, or if I was a Marine, an easy 6 months. Just saying. But so from a family perspective, there was always a level of anxiety. The good thing about the later deployments was communication became easy. By the time I got to the third deployment in 08, 09, I had a laptop and Wi-Fi in my room. I had a cell phone. I had all the stuff I needed to communicate back home, so it was easier to talk. It was easier to keep the family reassured that we were okay. Not so much in the early days.
What about you?
You know, history is an interesting thing because we can sit here on this side of the event and look back and talk about our enormous success in Iraq. But 20 years ago, that was not known to us, right? We're going to go in and fight one of the, what was it, like the 5th most powerful military on the planet. And so enormous success wasn't known to us. And when you're standing on the precipice looking into the abyss, you don't know, right? It's easy for us now to say, yeah, it was great, we did all these great things, and we only got shot at this many times. But when you're getting ready to go, that anxiety is a much, much different thing. And I think it was really hard on the families. You know, in our community where we had been at war in Afghanistan for a period of time, we were in Afghanistan. We're fighting. We were joking about this earlier. We're fighting a 13th century country. Now we're going into Iraq and we're fighting a modern 1960s era country with one of the most powerful militaries. And so we didn't know about our success. We didn't know how it was going to be, and so that anxiety was real. And, I can remember, being in my lodging in Germany and calling home on for the 5 minutes that I got, and listening to my son's heartbeat through my wife's pregnant, and listening, knowing that, we're going to have a kid, but I'm not there to support, and all those things that they're working through. And then, that's when organizations get tight. And what we're really good at in the military is putting our arms around the rest of the families in our community, in our squadron, and making sure that everyone's cared for while loved ones are deployed. Now, we didn't deploy quite the same way. We would be sent out on a mission, and sometimes it's 45 days, sometimes it's 60 days. You don't know when you're really coming home, but you're going to come home for a couple of days, do laundry, and then go right back out because we were supporting the invasion. So, but yeah, the anxiety is real when you're on that side of history.
It was very real. I mean, the interesting note is you talk about the anxiety of it, and you talk about the family aspect of it, is when we came home, and every war has its difficulties. When we came home, two things. One, you get the pep talk before you leave the attack position from General Wallace. He says, hey, Baghdad at home. Because part of our mindset when we first did the invasion was, this is Desert Storm. We're going to get to Baghdad. Baghdad's going to fall. We're packing up and going home. We got to Baghdad. That didn't happen. So that was another impact on our families. We had to call them and tell them, oh, by the way, CENTCOM's leaving. We're staying. And we're staying here for an extra 6 months. That was another impact on the families. But when you think through all the things they went through, one of the saddest aspects of it was when we came home, finally came home in March of 2004 when we closed back in Heidelberg, the number of marital problems that we faced when we came back was astronomical. I've never seen so many divorces happen so quickly. And it was all, whatever happened in those 12 and 13 months we were gone, 14 they counted great time. But you never truly understand the impact on families until it's over. And you see some of the other fallout that happens.
Well, in a sense, I guess, compared to you gentlemen, I'm a little bit fortunate in the sense that I wasn't married at the time. I didn't have any children on the way or anything like that, so now having 2 kids is very blessed to not having these that kind of stuff. So I feel for you guys in that regard. But there was anxiety there. I had parents that were worried about me, things like that. Once I got over there and realized that, okay, my life is this base for the next few months or whatever it is, I remember saying at one time, I think to my mother, who was quite concerned, I said, Mom, there's places in America that are more dangerous than where I'm currently sitting. And she got a laugh out of that, and it seemed to calm her down some. But, you know, there was still a threat. You know, there was still the concern of indirect fire and things like that. And, you know, compared to the guys going outside the wire, I felt safe. You know, I didn't really have that kind of concern. But my concern was more for the guys going out and what I could do to help them. But I too, you know, coming back to, you know, when the unit gets back, you know, those marital problems, you're right on that. That point, Mike, is they come out, and all of a sudden there's counseling, there's, you know, to be candid, you know, don't hit your wife and don't kill yourself classes when you come home. Some of them worked, unfortunately. Some of them still chose that route. Sadly enough, we had, in a different unit I was with later on, we had, I think we had 3 suicides in 3 months after getting back from deployment. So the toll that it takes, it's definitely, I think it's down to the individual and their ability to not only cope, but get the support from the people that are there willing and ready to support them. And I think a lot of us kind of, you know, because we're tough and all that, whatever, we'll cut ourselves off, and it becomes a bigger problem. You know, a lot of those narrow problems that I was privy to were because they weren't talking to each other, and trying to solve it through alcohol or other means, and it leads to darker places. But you know, I think unit cohesion definitely builds while you're out, and that helps and everything like that. But it can't be to the detriment of the unit you're leading when you go forward. And I think the military has maybe gotten a little better at that. I mean, like you said, family readiness groups, that wasn't a thing, you know. Now it's a pretty permanent deal, and I would hope it's only gotten better since I've gotten out. Yeah, I think too that, you know, being prepared and feeling prepared probably helps with some of the anxiety too, and you know, just getting the experience under your belt, making something normal definitely helps.
So give people some chance for questions. I'm going to ask everyone, starting with Colonel Peeler. What do you want? What's the one thing you'd like to say to Americans, to this group, that you've thought about, what you learned, what you think the military learned, what society should learn? What's the one thing you'd like people to take out of this 20th anniversary?
Put me on the spot there with a tough question.
If someone has an immediate thought, they can take your place.
I'll share what I shared with Mike last week in the office, and that's just about telling the story. So I grew up in, like I said, in Central California. Not a lot of military there, but I did know that my grandfather had served in World War II, and he was an aircraft mechanic, but he never really talked about it. And some of the things that I know he did now, I wish I could go back and talk to him and hear about it, right? He told us, the only story I ever remember him telling is, he was an aircraft mechanic, and they were out at the chow hall, they were eating, it was the end of their shift, and the commander came out and said, get back in there, we got more work to do. And they were all disgruntled, they were frustrated, they'd already done their work, and they had to paint these airplanes. Well, it turns out that the Germans were getting into their formations and shooting them down from within, and so they painted these stripes on these airplanes, and they didn't understand why. And it was a few days later that we invaded Normandy. Right? It was to be able to sit down and have that conversation with them. I wish I could, but I lost him, 20 years ago, and I can't have that conversation. In a future assignment that I happened to be in command of an organization that had previously was that group that flew those airplanes across the English Channel, and it very well could have been the same organization that he was in, and he painted those stripes on the airplanes that I was now in command of, but I'll never know, because all that's lost to history. So it's time to tell our story, and I think it's important, it's cathartic to tell our story. And this is important for everyone, not just our kids and our grandkids, but for us too. be able to tell these stories. So thank you for having us.
Right. Heather.
Can I defer to Jim, so I can go last?
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to have talks like this over the years, and every time I'm always humbled by what I hear from others that I've spoken with, or from the audience that is listening and things like that. And as far as the take home on it, in addition to what the Colonel said, what I think is so important is talking to veterans and getting those stories, especially if they're related to them. I mean, it's such a perspective. You gain such a perspective, I think, from it. But I think one of the unfortunate things about the war in Iraq, and you can probably say a lot of this about the larger global war on terror, is I feel like the political narrative of it is the one the general population thinks of when they think of Iraq. They think, oh, massive weapons of mass destruction. Well, we never found those weapons of mass destruction. Then we stood there, we were in there for 5 and 10 more years still fighting, and got caught up in the insurgency, trying to do nation building, all this stuff, and then you see how Afghanistan ended a year and a half ago. And the political narrative, whatever. For that time, for that last 20 years, there were people going to those countries, volunteering to go to those countries, and fight for the freedoms that we swear in allegiance to when we take that oath. And I think the bravery and the will to do that is something to respect and revere a bit. And that is what I think should be more remembered about 20 years since the invasion of Iraq, or 22 since September 11th in Afghanistan. It's the story of service for those events, and what one day in September did to a generation of people who now are old enough to retire if they joined on that day. And oftentimes had their sons or daughters old enough to enlist while they were still in and fighting the same wars in the same places that they were doing 20 years ago. And I think that story of service is captured through talking to veterans and things like that, and documenting them through the Oral History Project, the Veteran History Project, and various other ways. But I guess if people ask questions, to answer their questions. Because otherwise, if we keep it bottled up, all of a sudden we're 80 years old if we're lucky, and now you feel like talking, then it might be too late.
And this is a very appropriate note to end on, since the Military and Veteran Student Success Center has been pivotal, and I thank you for both their people, and this is a joint VHP effort. Stand up, a little applause first. So Mike, what's your bottom?
So the bottom line is this. I spent the last 3 days reading different pundits and historical people rewriting or reimagining or revisioning Iraq. And when I think about Iraq and the Iraq that I knew, I think about a couple things. I think about a people that we liberated from a tyrant. When we went through southern Iraq, as we cleared town after town, village after village, and hut after hut, one of my most vivid memories is driving on the path as we move from location to location. But as you go through a village or a town or a gathering of mud huts, the number of Iraqi people who would come out and line the road. And at first we were really concerned what they were doing. And then I realized that all they were trying to do was to reach up and touch the American flag on my shoulder. Literally, all they wanted to do was to touch the American flag that was on my shoulder. To say thank you for their liberation also go back to the joy, absolute hysterical joy of the Iraqi people the day that Uday and Qusay got taken out. Because I was there. And the people in the neighborhoods went celebratory because those two had been taken out and we had shown them the proof. Because they were the most brutal people they'd ever known. And it was interesting because, you know, we talk about Iraqi freedom and all the phases of it. But at the end of the day, we've taken a country with a rich history that for so many years was controlled by a very small group of people. But we've now given that country an opportunity to govern itself. Are they getting it right? Do I agree with all this? No. I mean, I've still got friends that we still talk about it. We still talk about influence from outside sources. But I think what I always try to tell everyone at the end of the day is, you know, I always try to imagine, you know, the guys in World War II who marched into Paris when they liberated Paris. And the feeling they must have had as a GI, as a dog-faced soldier, liberating Paris and everyone throwing flowers at it and wine and all that stuff. And I go back to those Iraqis who were just trying to touch my flag because they were free and they had a chance to be free. So when I think about the long-term message for me, it is about acknowledging the sacrifice of so many. U.S., British, Canadian, Australian, Polish, the Tongans who were there with us, as well as the Iraqi people who, as we move further and further to the bridge, they're with us. Because it is a story of success. And when you take a long picture of the world, it will be success. And I will always believe that. So, for me, it's a story of success. It's not yet finished, it's not yet completed. But it is, for me, it'll always be about those Iraqis trying to touch that flag on my shoulder. And I'll never forget that feeling.
All right, the perfect place to end. Thank you so much for everyone. Any questions from the audience?
What are some things you did for recreation?
Recreation?
Fun.
For fun? Yeah, so let me tell you, OIF 1, the invasion. Fun during the invasion, there was no fun during the invasion. But after May 1st, once we called mission accomplished, prior to May 1st, all the Corps headquarters came up and we had settled Camp Victory, right there at the off-fall bounce. So I was the original mayor of Camp Victory. So it's a funny story. So everyone always talks about how the village were numbered at Camp Victory. And no one can ever figure out why the Corps headquarters, because Seafleet went into the palace, and the Corps headquarters was across the street. And no one can ever figure out why the Corps headquarters was building 0. Why is it building 0? Why not building 1? And I finally had to admit to the boss, I said, sir, it's a real simple answer. I forgot about it when I started numbering all the buildings. By the time I remembered it, all the maps were already done. So I just called it 0 and had a good day with it. But recreation, the early parts of the invasion, and we got downtime. There was domino tournaments, spades going on. You know, I used to have to shut them down at night. Okay, that's enough. We've been out here long enough. Let's get inside. But yeah, I mean, souls are souls. They're going to find ways to entertain themselves. We had a dart board in the company headquarters. So we started a dart league. So we actually had dart tournaments in there in the company headquarters. But I will tell you, the one thing the military does do right is MWR. MWR showed up pretty quick. I won't tell that story. MWR showed up pretty quick. You know, the most amazing thing to me was when Burger King flew into Saddam International Airport and set up shop. And we used to have convoys of people going to, but it was still Saddam International Airport. We hadn't renamed it yet. And Burger King was already there selling Whoppers with cheese. Later deployments, as things got more mature in theater, and we had softball leagues, we had flag football leagues. I mean, we had, it's a certain point deployments became normal. If you weren't outside the wire, you played softball and just waited for the sirens to go off. The siren went off, you quick jumped into the bunker, you got the all clear, you went back out to the inning, you were in. So we did all those things. We had running routes, we had all this stuff there that was normal. We tried to keep it as normal as we could for the service members who were there, as much as possible.
So Air Force usually talks about air-conditioned tents at this point.
There are some stories, not all of them good. We did our best, I'll just leave it at this, we did our best to try to maintain some level of normalcy for our folks when they're deployed. There was a time when we could not have we had air-conditioned tents. They were taken away from us because the Army in the same camp did not have air-conditioned tents. And it was unfair for them to not have it, us to have it, so we took our air conditionings away.
And then the Air Force went home.
They just quit right out.
But as you know, in any deployed environment, you're going to try to take your culture a little bit with you. You try to have some sense of normalcy so that folks aren't stressed all the time. No matter what it is, we're living in tents, and there's one rec tent. Folks would go there, and the team would come together, even in their off time, and try to have some downtime and some fun.
And that was, when you're talking culture piece of, Mike, that's one of the other things that was hard about it. So when we first got there was a coalition. We were literally a coalition. We got to the Off-Ball Palace, the Australians who were with us, and they took over one of the pools, and that became the Aussie pool. And unless you were Aussie, you didn't get invited to that pool. But that was something that they used, that they enjoyed, and it was part of what they did for their service members was to refurbish that pool. At the time, I didn't have the means to refurbish our pool. Then I found one at the other end of Camp Victor, where we eventually put up our AAFES store. I had a pool in the back of it that I paid, a buttload of money to refurbish it, fill it up, and stayed in service for about 3 months before it got shut down, and it was too much to maintain. But those different cultures had different, different coalition members had different aspects of what they did. The Aussie pool, they may or may not have had alcohol beverages there. We didn't, but they might have. But the other cool thing we did is once we got into an established theater, the first people I remember coming over, Cherokee Parks, Robert De Niro, Rebecca St. John Stamos, whatever her name is, and Alyssa Milano was the first group I remember coming over to inspire us. Interesting time. Really great picture with both of them, Rebecca and Alyssa kissing me on both cheeks. But again, things like that started showing up. Kid Rock came over with Sectet and did a concert at Buyout, in one of the hangars at Buyout. Fantastic. So they wound up doing things like that as well. And you start seeing more of the MWR stuff showing up. The longer we were there, the more it became just a rotation.
Okay, so at this point now we're going to hear about chewing sand from the Marines for fun.
Well, maybe not sand, but crayons, certainly. A lot of what they discussed, we would try to do too, had some softball leagues. PT was a big part of it, running or lifting, things like that. We had, different unofficial, one guy, knew jujitsu or something, so he would train other people. If they felt like going out and working off some steam, things like that. We'd DVDs on laptops because we didn't have a movie theater or anything to go to. Somebody got a Nintendo Wii out there somehow. I don't know if you had it ordered, delivered, or mailed or whatever, but we had our weed hooked up to a 18-inch television set for a bit. That was exciting. But, you know, we'd make do. You know, everybody in here is a veteran, right? Yeah? For the most part? You know what we do. You sit around, you BS, you debate about something that's not important but becomes a mountain out of the molehill and stuff like that. And because Ford's better, no, Chevy's better, things like that. And which movie's the greatest, or who's the best one to look at, that kind of stuff. You know, you pass the time and you try to have a good time of it, and then when it's time to go to work, you go to work. And, you know, we didn't have access to an Australian pool or anything like that, that may or may not have had alcohol. In fact, I think the only time we got the alcohol ration was at
Marine Corps birthday.
Marine Corps birthday, yeah. We got,
Tuesday, day out of 10.
we got 2 very warm Bud Lights.
Just sad.
I learned in Iraq that I was in fact not an alcoholic because I had 0 withdrawals or desire to drink those warm Budweisers. Yeah, so we made do. We had fun where we could, and you know, build the unit cohesion and esprit de corps and all that stuff. Of course, you know, sand castles, crayon pictures and stuff like that too. But
I have another question.
Outside of friends and family, what did you guys miss most about home while you were deployed?
Wow. Outside from being deployed, it wasn't a good.
Grass.
actually, you mentioned grass and sand. It snowed while I was in Iraq. We woke up one morning, it was January of '08, I think, probably. We woke up one morning, there was a sheet of snow across the desert. It didn't last for a few hours, but I stepped on the roofs and stuck around on some of the roofs for a while. So we had a snowball fight in Iraq, and then it all of a sudden became mud pretty quickly after that.
Like everything was made out of gravel.
Yeah.
So walking on gravel day after day after day, it just won't make sense.
I don't know the answer to that question. That's a really, I've never actually, because depending upon the phase you were there, you had everything you needed. I mean, the DFAC had, if you wanted short order to get a cheeseburger, you could get a cheeseburger. If you wanted stir fry, you could get stir fry. If you wanted a steak, you went on Tuesday night and you got a steak. And if you wanted lobster, it was Friday night. I mean, we ate better than the Air Force ate, I think, when we were deployed. So from a, you know, what did I miss? Convenience, maybe?
Did you go and just do whatever you wanted?
Yeah,
The
convenience, the
yeah.
freedom to
To
go
punch
where I
out
wanted
muscle.
to, and, you know, I mean, it wasn't, I can't say we didn't go on vacation, but, yeah, maybe convenience, but outside of family and friends, I mean, everything I needed was right there. I mean, I worked 18-hour days, that's what I was there to do, so I don't, yeah, that's a tough question.
It's funny how quickly things just become normal. You know, back in the rear, you wouldn't expect to, what do you mean I got to stay till 1900 tonight to do X? But then when you're deployed, if you're not doing 12 hours, you know, that's the abnormal. If you're doing less than 12, that's the abnormal.
So plus, if you're not doing 12, then what are you doing?
Exactly.
Then you're bored.
Yeah.
And you're in trouble somewhere.
Yeah, the job's not done properly. So, yeah, the normality bias, whatever, kicks in pretty quickly. You're just there doing what you do, and the stuff that you wouldn't think of doing at home because there's so many better entertainment options suddenly become appealing. Like, oh yeah, I'll try that. Oh, yeah, let's watch that movie that I didn't care to see at home, but yeah, I'll watch it now because why not? What else are we gonna watch?
I mean, the last thing I wanted to do was to spend the first Friday of every month with my battalion commander and all of our staff doing movie night. But we did it every Friday, and we bought pizzas, and we all had a good time. Because we had to make the overage.
Go ahead.
Pre-accessibility to technology, what was the longest time frame you recall not speaking to family, friends?
I will tell you, during the deployment phase, during the invasion phase, that we were there, obviously the initial part of it, you know, I said March 18th, I found out, went to tab, just not knowing what my dad's condition was. Didn't know until the beginning of April that he was okay. After that, I think we had, once MWR showed up, 6 months into it, you had your 5 or 10 minute phone calls. The one benefit to having been stationed in Germany is that we were on the European phone network. So I could call from Baghdad, I could call the Heidelberg switch, and they could transfer me to my family. So I still had an ability to talk to my family. Plus we had the Iraqi cell phones, again European, so I could call the German cell phones. It was much more convenient than if we were someone from the States. Units deployed from the States had it much rougher because they literally had to wait live for the 5-minute phone calls. To the point where we felt so guilty about the ability we were calling that we opened up some of our office phones to MWR certain times for other units. We had a Florida National Guardian working for us, and I gave them 3 hours a night to come in and make phone calls back to the States using our Heidelberg switch. He's trying to make do. But initially, there was no comms. I'll call you when I get there.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening to our panel, and thank our panel for being open about everything that happened. And I'm sure the Aussies had drinks. Just saying. Anyway, thank you so much. Now you may notice we have snacks. MWR did not provide